other question you have that's existential, you actually already know that answer at a deep level. So what we're really doing in meditating is we're essentially leaving the intellect behind, and we're going inward toward the mainframe. We're trying to get in touch with something much deeper than the intellect. We're trying to get in touch with the intelligence that's running the whole show.
The nonprofit TAT Foundation was created in 1973 to bring spiritual seekers and finders together. We publish books, videos, and a free online newsletter. We maintain a website of spiritual resources and hold 4 spiritual retreat weekends each year. Our goal is to offer practical guidance for following a spiritual path and living a spiritual life. For more information, go to tatfoundation.org. That's tatfoundation.org.
Like I said last night, I was really happy that the theme of this retreat was meditation and going within, because meditation was certainly my path. And I sort of see myself as a cheerleader, encouraging people to meditate, and enjoy explaining why that's very helpful for triggering spiritual realizations and all kinds of realizations for that matter. So the first question, why meditate? And I found in the Mayo Clinic, and this, I just thought this was kind of interesting, because the Mayo Clinic and a lot of medical facilities around the country encourage people to meditate because it has a lot of healthful benefits. And but in their initial introduction, they just said meditation originally was meant to help deepen understanding of the sacred and mystical forces of life. These days, meditation is commonly used for relaxation and stress reduction. And their little definition on it is, during meditation, you focus your attention and eliminate the stream of jumbled thoughts that may be crowding your mind and causing stress. This process may result in enhanced physical and emotional well-being. And then they give a whole bunch of different things that are health benefits. That's not why we're here, but there's no doubt that meditation lowers blood pressure, lowers resting pulse rate, has all kind of benefits from a health standpoint. That's one of the reasons they recommend it. But we're obviously not here just for health benefits, even though that may happen. We're here because, in general, we're trying to find answers to questions and resolve issues that you can't resolve through the intellect. And one of the reasons and one of the ways that first of all, I define meditation just slightly differently. I say that meditation is the process of shifting attention away from thoughts, because thoughts are really the issue, the problem. And so one of the ways that I explain this to people is, imagine that the entire earth was a giant mainframe computer, because what we are is incomprehensibly intelligent. What we are causes every blood cell in our body to go where it needs to go. And if I ask people, which I often do, how do you grow your hair, teeth, and bones? Nobody knows. How do you see? Nobody knows. How do you think a thought? Nobody knows. This supreme intelligence that we are is running the whole show. It's doing the whole thing, and that's all that's here. And meditation is an attempt to hook into that mainframe computer, which is everywhere and everything. Now, people have different words for the absolute. Nisargadatta said, I am that. I like to say I'm this, because it feels a little more intimate. So when I say I'm this, I'm talking about the whole shebang, the entire cosmos, as well as this room and the people sitting in it. And if we think of the intellect, which is an evolutionary advance, it's like a tiny little laptop computer sitting on top of the mainframe. But unfortunately, when we grow from childhood to adulthood, we shift from a direct interaction with reality to this little laptop. And so we begin to function through the intellect, through thoughts. And we become so used to doing that we don't realize there are any other options. And so the intellect is great for solving problems like, what do I do with my car keys? Okay, with the intellect, we can go back in our memory and we can kind of picture the last time we had our car keys, and we can probably figure out where to look for the car keys. If we get up in the morning and our car won't start, the intellect's great for that, because if you have any knowledge of automobiles, you know that it's probably either a fuel or an electrical problem. Maybe the battery's dead, maybe you've run out of gas. If you don't know any of that, you can always take it to a mechanic. So intellectually, you know what to do. So the intellect is how we operate most of the time, because in the path from childhood to adulthood, we leave the body behind and we begin to live in our heads, almost totally. And as we think these thoughts and we identify with the body, we become very attached to all these ideas. And so it's very hard to get out of our heads. And that's what we're talking about in meditation. We're talking about how do we leave the intellect behind and connect to something much vaster, the intelligence that's underlying everything, the intelligence that's running the whole show. Because when you think about it, the intellect only deals with images, ideas, and symbols, nothing else. So the intellect only deals with imagination. And yet, what we're interested in is what's actual. So this is actual. Thinking that it's a chair is imaginary. That's a distinction that we make through the intellect. As we grow up, we make all these distinctions. Wall, ceiling, floor, me, and me's the biggest distinction of all. We learn that we have a name, we become attached to the body, we identify with the body, and if you're like I was, with a real strong, hardcore sense of selfhood, eventually it feels like almost like there's a little person inside the head looking out of the eyes at the world. And none of that's true. And so the real question is, what is looking out of our eyes at the world? How do we get in touch with that? How do we find that? So when you think about it, we talk a lot about duality and non-duality. There really is no duality. Duality is totally imaginary. All there is this. It's unified, it's infinite, it's incomprehensibly intelligent. How do we get in touch with that? Well, I found some interesting quotes from Einstein, and it points to this, even though he's talking about scientific discovery. Listen to what he wrote, because the process of scientific discovery is just like the process of existential discovery. I think 99 times and find nothing. I stop thinking, swim in silence, and the truth comes to me. So the truth that comes to him is not coming from the intellect, all right? Because he's shifting from thinking to silence. Listen to this next one. The intellect has little to do with the road to discovery. There comes a leap in consciousness, call it intuition. The solution comes to you and you don't know how or why. It's right on target for what we're talking about here. When something vibrates, the electrons of the entire universe resonate with it. Everything is connected. The greatest tragedy of human existence is the illusion of separateness. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. How to get in touch with what's actual and get out of our heads, essentially. And I'm somebody who really lived in his head. So in my case, meditation was very effective, dramatically so. And I'll talk a little about that story in a minute. But one of the points I try to make, and there's one thing to remember. I tell people, you can't make a mistake. No one has ever made a mistake. It is impossible to make a mistake because there is no Bob, Tom, John, Carol, Alice at the center of what's happening. There's just this, and this is what's doing everything. And this doesn't make a mistake. So any idea of a mistake, like people think back and they say, well, I had a choice between A and B and I picked B, I made a mistake. No, they didn't make a mistake. It only appears to be a mistake in your imagination, looking back and thinking that there might have been an alternative scenario. There never was. Okay? Whatever you did is exactly what you had to do at that time. In the same way, whatever you're doing now is exactly what you must be doing. This is the way this unfolds. So if you're confused, that's perfect. That's what this is doing. this is confused in the form of a particular human being. If you're happy, this is happy in the form of a particular human being. So you can't make a mistake. Now, the only reason I point that out, particularly when we're talking about meditation, is because many people wonder, well, am I meditating correctly? Am I following the right meditative path? You know, should I be doing what Nisargadatta did? Or should I be doing what the Zen people are doing, and so forth? You can't make a mistake. Whatever you resonate with is what this is doing. Impossible to make a mistake. So bear that in mind as we go along. As adults, we're really addicted to thinking. We were talking about this a little earlier. And in my case, I was really addicted to thinking. It just seemed like thoughts were incessant. They never slowed down. And when I tell in a moment about my personal story, you'll get a sense of that. But I want to also mention something. At some point, I'm going to talk about the difference between experiences and realizations. Because what we're really interested in is triggering spiritual insights, spiritual realizations about what's going on. Because whether we know it or not, we're really strongly attached to a bunch of thoughts, all kinds of thoughts. Some people have negative self-image thoughts. You know, I was really skinny when I grew up. I was always the skinniest person in the class. In high school, I wore big, thick socks, and I wore a jacket to hide my skinny little arms and my skinny little ankles and so forth, because I was so sensitive about being skinny. If I had been overweight, I would have been sensitive about that, because you're real conscious about what everybody else is thinking. All right? I went into gymnastics mainly to build up upper body strength and gain weight so that I wouldn't be a skinny little weakling that people would kick sand in his face. But there is a difference between causation and correlation. This is really key, because if I tell people to meditate in order to find the truth, I can't guarantee that there'll be any spiritual insights. All I can tell you is that they're highly correlated. All right? And the reason I know that is because there were some British websites a few years ago. And I think maybe one or two are still going on, but what these websites did, they asked people, if you've had big spiritual insights or experiences, realization, whatever, send us a description of what happened, and most importantly, tell us what you were doing immediately preceding that. In other words, what were you doing just before this happened? Well, can't do anything about number one. What do you think was number one? And it was what were you doing, or what was your condition or your situation? Number one on the list was abject despair.
Yeah,
you think about Eckhart Tolle, Satyam Nadi, Ramana Maharshi worried about death and so forth. Abject despair. So I can't tell people to go to abject despair. All right, but number two on the list is meditation. All right. If it wasn't abject despair, meditation was number two on the list. That's what they were doing prior to some spiritual breakthrough. Number three on the list was being alone in nature. Okay? And that's, it's amazing. People are, I can't think of how many spiritual sages have been drawn to the wilderness, walked off into the desert or whatever, because there's a sense intuitively that in nature I'm more connected, all right, to what's going on. I'm not distracted by my usual thoughts. If you're walking in nature, you tend to be looking around. You tend to be actually looking at what's there rather than constantly looking at your thoughts. Number four was reading spiritual literature. I won't even bother to go with the others on the list. I think number 47 was sex, and that was only reported by women. Women claim that orgasm sometimes led to spiritual breakthroughs, all right? But meditation was number two on the list, so pretty significant. So if you really wanted to combine them all, you'd meditate in nature and take along a book and read some spiritual literature along the way. So the real key is how to access this deeper level, all right? Now, in my personal story, I had, from a pretty early age, a lot of questions. My parents tell me that all I asked was why when I was growing up, and probably a lot of you did too. And I wrote down just a few of the questions I had. I was looking back, it's kind of humorous. The questions really got going at about the age of 20. Up until then, I was just a happy camper doing my thing. I was a science nerd. I built science projects and I lived for science fairs. That was my thing. And I built rockets and all kinds of crap. So how did life appear in what appears to be a lifeless universe? To me, that was a real quandary. I thought, it can't be what they were telling me in college at that time. The idea at that time was, oh, it's like a monkey sitting at a typewriter, and if he types long enough, he'll type out the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, if you know anything about statistics and odds, that's absurd. You know, it's 32,000 to 1 that you'll draw a full house in a card game of poker. The idea that life could occur randomly like that is just absurd. And so intuitively, I knew that couldn't be true. All right? But that was the prevailing idea, and I still hear people talk about that today, that that's how it all started. And because I was raised in a very fundamentalist tradition, my big question was, is there even such a thing as God? I didn't even ask questions like, where is God this moment, or anything like that. Some people have that. But is there a God? Is there any kind of a higher power? Where was I before I was born? Where am I going to be after I die? Where am I going? Is there really a heaven or a hell? Because this was stuff I was indoctrinated with in a very fundamentalist religious tradition. And for somebody in that kind of tradition, it's a big deal knowing the answers to these kind of questions. And I wondered what could explain spiritual miracles. In all the spiritual literature, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism, you read these stories about really unusual stuff happening. Today in science we call them non-local events. All right, things that cannot be explained rationally. And a lot of what's in the Bible, which is what I grew up with, I thought, that's unlikely. But some of the stories there really sounded true to me. You know, the story about the woman that touches Jesus' cloak, and he says, who touched me? I felt the power go out of me. And I read that, I thought, man, that really sounds true to me. That sounds like something that happened. But if that were true, what could explain that? These were just type questions I had. And then it got into when I got into physics, what is a subatomic particle really? I drove professors crazy because they talk about photons and electrons. What are these things? You know, I can touch a chair, but I can't touch a photon. What is a photon? You know, if I could make myself the size of a photon, what would I see? That was the kind of crazy question I would ask. And the classes all thought I was nuts, and I guess the professor did too. And what could explain all the observer paradoxes in modern physics and every other field of science? And then later, what is art? What is truth? What is beauty? Time, space. Then I got into Zen. What is Mu? That's classic koan in Zen. They have all these major koans I read about for years, but had no idea what the answer was. What is enlightenment? I read about a case where a young guy came in for an interview with a Zen master. And as he walked in, the Zen master said, drop off your body and mind. And the guy said, suddenly everything fell away and I was walking forward and backward at the same time. I read that and I thought, what is he talking about? You know, what kind of experience could that be that you would describe it like that? And so I had just pages and pages and pages of questions like this, all right? Now here's the important point. I spent 20 years thinking about this stuff, all right? And I never found a single answer. And that's really a key factor because the laptop doesn't have the answer to that. The intellect only deals in images, ideas, and symbols. It does not deal with what is actual, okay? So thinking, never found an answer. So at the age of 40, I was under a certain amount of business stress, and I was worrying about employees and subcontractors and customers and how to keep everybody happy and how to keep building enough projects and make enough money and so forth. And at a certain point, I began to realize that the mind chatter, all the internal dialogue that was going on in my head might be contributing to the stress I was feeling. It was just a sense of that, just an intuitive sense of that. And I just happened to pick up a little book. By this time, I had been reading Zen books for 7 years. I hadn't solved a single koan, I hadn't found a single answer. Even though I love reading Zen and all that, hadn't helped a bit. Okay? But I thought, maybe maybe there's some way to have some peace of mind. And I happened to pick up a new Zen book. And it was the first Zen book because, today we have videos, YouTubes, we have thousands of books that you can buy about non-duality and meditation, all this stuff. Those weren't available when I grew up. You couldn't find them in the bookstore. And all the books about Zen didn't even talk about what they did. They never even mentioned meditation. And I happened to pick up a new book that described a simple meditation exercise. And it said, if you do this little exercise, it will increase your peace of mind. And I thought, oh man, I got to try that. Even if it doesn't work, I got to try it because I'd like to have just a break. Because this monologue that's going on in the head is nonstop. It's like thought all day long. Or it seemed that way, I'll put it that way. And so I read the exercise, and I actually misread the instructions. It didn't matter, it turned out. But I actually thought that the idea was to count either breath inhalations or exhalations up to 10 and then start over again. In reading it, I thought it meant if you lost the count, you had to start over. So I thought, well, I don't know whether it'll work or not, but I'll walk around a coliseum, basketball coliseum at a university, and I'll see if this might help. So I walked around this coliseum for an hour at lunch every day, counting breath exhalation. Well, my mind was so busy and so all over the place that I never could get past the count of 3. And it was very frustrating because I'd get to 3 and find myself lost in some train of thought about a construction project or customers or whatever. And then I did that for about 10 days, I think it was, maybe 9 days. And I thought, well, even if the meditation thing doesn't work, at least I'm getting an hour of exercise, and that reduces stress somewhat. But on about the 8th, 9th, 10th day, somewhere in there, I was driving through town, and I looked over and saw a house that was a fairly unusual house that I had never seen before. And I thought, that's really strange. I've driven down this street 1,000 times. So I've obviously driven by this house, and this house is obviously 30, 40 years old or more. I've never seen it before. And that really aroused my curiosity. And I had that strange thought. I thought, could this simple little meditation exercise I'm doing have caused me to see this house? Well, that made me really curious. And I was already curious enough as is. So in the afternoon after I got off work, I started walking through the countryside near where we lived. We were kind of out away from town. And I started making an attempt to see if I could just look at the world without naming it or thinking about it or commenting upon it. I didn't have a name for what I was doing. Today I call it ATA minus T, attending the actual minus thoughts. Because I'd also begun to wonder, what do animals see when they look at the world? They don't look and think that's a tree, but they don't walk into a tree. So I thought, when they look at the world, what do they see? I look over there and I think tree, all right? And I thought, same thing with babies. Little babies don't look out there and think the names of all this stuff. So what do they see? So I began doing that exercise, which is another form of meditation in which you're just looking, listening, feeling, and so forth. And when I did that, all kinds of memories from childhood began to come back. I began to smell things that I hadn't smelled in years and years. I began to see things that I hadn't seen in 10 or 15 years. And the funniest part of the story was, I came home and I told my wife, I said, Carol, there are still birds and squirrels in the world. And she said, of course. What did you think? I said, I don't know. I hadn't seen one in 10 years. I just thought the hunters had killed them all. I mean, that's how in my head I was. All right, so it gives you an example of how totally lost in thought I was. So that led to the first realization. I realized I've been living in my head. For the last 10 years, I've been so focused on thoughts about construction, business, relationships, you name it, everything, that I hadn't even looked at the world. I hadn't really looked around. I hadn't been listening. I hadn't been smelling. I hadn't smelled honeysuckle in 15 or 20 years. All these unusual things, walking through a new mown, down this one road, they had mowed this field, and it was like the smell of new mown grass. I thought, I remember that from childhood. It hadn't gone away, but I did. I went off and lived in my head for 10 years. So that was like the first insight. Well, as that happened, that made me more curious. So then I started meditating the third hour. I I meditate an hour a day, walking around the Coliseum, walk through the countryside in the afternoon, looking and listening. At night, I started sitting down and doing a real formal Zen exercise that by that time I had read about, because now I was really interested. I was doing a breath awareness exercise and doing a real formal kind of meditation. So I was meditating about 3 hours a day, lunch, afternoon, evening. And after about 5 months, I sat down to meditate one night, and I was doing a breath following exercise, and I was focusing so strongly on it that all of a sudden I began to be the breathing. I began to feel it rather than just follow it, and it began to go deeper and deeper. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something really bizarre was happening because I could feel a lot of strange somatic phenomena. I could feel that there was a numbness spreading over my arms. We call it the off sensation in Zen. And it began to spread up. It felt like the whole body was becoming encased in a block of ice. It was solidifying, coalescing in some strange way. And this thing simply progressed, and then everything began to disappear. Thought stopped. Perception stopped. And after about 10 minutes, all there was pure awareness, an extremely blissful state. I didn't realize it, but I'd fallen into what we call nirvikalpa samadhi, a very deep state of samadhi. In Zen, they call it the falling off of body and mind. The next night, that lasted about an hour the first night, and there was no sense of time whatsoever. It's just that I'd had a clock there on the wall, and when I looked at it again, I realized, as I came out of this, I realized, oh, I was in that unusual state for an hour. And I knew it was a non-dual state because selfhood disappeared. Everything was gone. Time, space, totally. So the next night I sat down to meditate and just almost immediately fell into it again. That happened 3 nights in a row, and on the 4th morning I got up to go to work, and I had, in the middle of the morning, I was talking to a guy in his office when the phone rang, and I had a mind-blowing cosmic consciousness experience in which all of reality began to disintegrate. This thing lasted for quite a while. I had out-of-body experience. The sense of identity completely fell away. And at one point the thought appeared, who is perceiving this? I had no idea. I could not remember who I was, didn't know my name. And yet everything was crystal clear. I was able to tell some guys what to do on this construction project. And all the time I was doing, after reality disintegrated, there was this emotional pressure that came up, and I laughed nonstop for about 15 minutes. And when I got to the project, I had to, when I was talking to these guys and telling them what to do, I had to have my hand over my mouth, sort of like Rodin's The Thinker, so that nobody would see that I had this ear-to-ear grin, and then I wouldn't burst out laughing because I thought, they'll think I've gone insane, because I don't even know who I am. And I'm supposed to be a businessman, and I'm showing them what to do with a gas pipe and so forth. Well, when I left there, got in my car because I could tell that I was starting to, things were getting stranger and stranger. I was looking at my superintendent, but I was looking, the whole middle part of his body disappeared. I could see his head and his feet, but the middle was gone. And that began to freak me out. I looked over at the wall, and a huge gap was there, perception. Nothing there, just like nothing. And that began to scare me because I thought, oh, man, they're going to have to put me away in an institution. So I made an excuse, ran out of the house, jumped in my car, and ran down the bottom of the hill. When I hit the bottom of the hill, I'm Bob the builder. I thought, I'm back to normal. It was like mind-boggling, all right? During that event, I realized that everything is unified. There's no separation. I saw the infinite. It answered 7 of my questions were answered. And as I drove away from the project and I went up the road, I remember looking over at a tree. For the first time, I saw the difference between what a tree is and the idea of a tree, or the image of a tree, or the symbol tree. And that was a big breakthrough. In Zen, they call it passing through the gateless gate. I suddenly realized there's a big difference between this and the idea that it's a chair. Okay? Well, that was life-changing, needless to say. After that, I thought, golly, 7 of these answers were inside me. And it dawned on me, probably the meditation practice had triggered this. So I grabbed a bunch of books and read, and I had what in Zen's called a Kensho event, which is, in Christianity we would call it a cosmic consciousness event or a Christ consciousness event or something like that. And for about 3 days after that, I was just like Eckhart Tolle. I had no interest in anything personal. I was ready to give away everything I owned. I was in a rare state. I visited people in hospitals. I donated money anonymously. I was in a different world. It was like I had been catapulted from one world into another world, a world that I hadn't known existed. And I then realized, the biggest realization was, and the way we talk about that is, reality is not what we think it is. Realities cannot be imagined. It cannot be comprehended. It's intellectually incomprehensible. So that was like a major introduction. And because of that, I realized every other thing that I want to know is inside. All I've got to do is become silent enough for all of my other questions to be answered. And shortly after that, I joined a Zen group and began going to Zen silent retreats and so forth. And as I went on these Zen silent retreats and did a lot of sitting, more and more questions just suddenly got answered. And I was really lucky because I joined a Rinzai Zen group and not a Soto Zen group. Because in the Soto tradition, they don't ever talk about this stuff. In the Rinzai tradition, they do. And the Rinzai tradition uses koans. They have these 2,000 formal questions. All koans have very simple answers. All right? And so the one that we talk about a lot of times, just to give people an example of that, and you've all probably heard this, but how do you greet, if on the pathless path you meet an enlightened woman, how do you greet her with neither words nor silence? And all koans are designed to have like a mind hook to make you start thinking. All right, so if you start thinking about that, you might have trouble answering the question. All right, but Zen is interested in a direct response that's not a thinking response. So if the question were worded slightly differently, you'd have no trouble answering the question. And I experimented with this. I asked children and older people and then 60-year-olds the same kind of question. And I found out that kids were able to answer these questions pretty easily, a lot of them. As people got older, they became less and less able to see the answer. Okay? So how do you greet an enlightened woman with neither words nor silence? Anybody?
I remember the answer, so.
Sure, you can wave, bow, blow them a kiss, give them a hug. You could greet a woman in 100 different ways, all right? No words are necessary, all right? And half of all Zen koans don't use words to respond. They want the body to respond directly and instantaneously, okay? So they have all these koans, and the next one that I went in, they had these interviews, and you go in for an interview, and the first question the guy asked me, told me this story, and you've heard this story too, I'm sure. My grandfather had a riddle just like this that I grew up listening to. And he said a father and son were driving across town, and they were involved in this bad automobile accident. They rushed him to the hospital, and along the way the father died of his injuries. When they got to the hospital, they rushed this boy into the operating room, and they called all the doctors. And when the neurosurgeon came, the neurosurgeon took one look and said, "I can't operate on this boy. This is my son." Who was the neurosurgeon? Anybody?
I know the answer. I don't know.
I know.
I remember.
I didn't know the answer, you know. I had no idea. And the guy looks at me and says, it was his mother. I went, oh, God. All right. We're so conditioned to think of neurosurgeons and steamship captains and airplane pilots as men, we just overlook the obvious. Everybody has a mother and a father. Okay? But because neurosurgeon, oh, you know, who could that have been? You know, boy's mother. All koans are like that. If you're not thinking, the body will just respond and answer. And a lot of times in unusual ways. But it's like we've made all these distinctions, and they've all been subconsciously internalized. Like you don't have to think that's a chair. Intellect knows that. It's stored in the memory banks. All right? All this stuff is known. So all these internal distinctions are in there. The problem is we're so used to thinking that we overlook the obvious. And koans are just a simple way of helping break through that. And when the resolution to a koan occurs, it's like bam, it's very sudden. You just suddenly see the answer. Okay? And that answer doesn't come from the intellect. It's coming directly from the mainframe. Because deep down you know all this stuff. So I've heard people say, oh, well, koans don't have any answers. That's nonsense. They all have answers, simple answers. And any other question you have that's existential, you actually already know that answer at a deep level. So what we're really doing in meditating is we're essentially leaving the intellect behind, and we're going inward toward the mainframe. We're trying to get in touch with something much deeper than the intellect. We're trying to get in touch with the intelligence that's running the whole show. That's essentially what we're doing. Now, what are the different forms of meditation? Well, you know, the most common ones would be TM, mantras, repeating a mantra, mindfulness meditation. I call mindfulness ATA plus T, because in mindfulness, we sort of step back and we're watching everything. We're looking at what we call the outside world, and we're also looking at thoughts and feelings. But we're trying not to jump on board these thoughts and ride off into the distance. We're just stepping back and just watching it all. I'm not crazy about mindfulness because I experimented with it. I had spent 20 years thinking, so I didn't see any point in watching thoughts. I've been watching thoughts for a long time. So my attitude was, forget that. I'm much more interested in ATA minus T. I'm much more interested in looking at the world without thought. And just what do I see, hear, smell, taste, without naming it, without commenting upon it, and so forth. Now, one big advantage to ATA minus T, as well as many other forms of meditation, it cuts through that mental dialogue. In fact, as you do that more and more, the mental dialogue becomes less and less, until finally, if you do it enough, the mental dialogue can stop at any time. There's none of this. I remember Eckhart Tolle, my favorite quote of his was, somebody asked him in a TV interview, they said, what is your greatest attainment? And Eckhart did his silly little chuckle that he usually does. He said, well, there's no real attainment, but if I had to name an attainment for you, I'd say it's freedom from the compulsion of incessant thought. And I thought, oh man, I'm with you, Eckhart. You know, for somebody who was a compulsive thinker, it's great to be able not to think. And I often tell people, just like we were laughing on the porch earlier, 95% of thinking is unnecessary. Now, if you're a physicist and you work like Sean Pethel does, yeah, your job involves abstract thought. No problem. The problem for most people is that thought is a master instead of a servant. And we're attached to our thoughts. So this path is a path of becoming detached from thoughts and seeing through illusions. And so one of the big ones I had along the way, and the reason I titled my book Pouring Concrete, is that I had this idea, after having several of these breakthrough realizations and understanding more and more, like half my list of questions had been answered. I thought, if I could just go off to a mountaintop somewhere or a wilderness and meditate around the clock, I could go off and get enlightened and so forth. I didn't realize it was just a fantasy that I was attached to. And one day I was pouring concrete. And of course, needless to say, I'd been meditating a lot. In the middle of pouring concrete, we took a break. We leaned up beside the concrete truck in the shade there, and I was drinking some water. Boy, if I didn't have to be doing this dumb construction work, I could be off on a mountaintop. And all of a sudden, bam, I suddenly saw how that thought separated me from the truth of what is. And I asked myself this one question that's so simple. What must I be doing this moment? There was no doubt I had to be pouring concrete. And that was like a major breakthrough, because my wife had been worried that I was going to be like the Buddha and run off and leave her and the kid behind. And when I saw that, I thought, I got to be pouring concrete. That idea of running off the wilderness is just a fantasy, and it's separating me from what's happening now. And that's the only realization that ever occurred, that it had to happen twice for me to really get it. About a week later, I was getting a building permit, and I went in to get this building permit. It was one of these bureaucratic government offices, and I was, they were being slow, and I was getting impatient. And I was thinking, if I didn't have to be getting this building permit, I could be off. Bam! And, suddenly hit me again. I went, what must I be doing this moment? Getting a damn building permit. It was so obvious, and that did it. After I saw that twice, that was it. That ended fanatization. And the advantage to that was I realized that my path wasn't going to be like the Buddha and run off to the wilderness, because I loved my wife and my kid. I loved the business I was in. I loved everything I did practically, except all the damn thinking. But that showed me that my path, whatever it is, lies right through the middle of construction in my life that I'm already living. In other words, it's whatever I'm doing right now. So I always tell people, if you have any doubt about it, just ask yourself, what must you be doing this moment? Because if you ask it that way, it takes away the future. Okay? It eliminates fantasies. It eliminates these ideas that you ought to be doing something else. Okay? So right now, what must you be doing this moment?
Listening.
Yeah, sitting here, talking in a room, listening to some crazy guy talk about meditation. All right? It's really obvious. And if you'll ask that question periodically, if you have any doubts whatsoever, you'll discover that whatever you're doing is exactly what you must be doing. If you're confused and you think, I shouldn't be confused, nonsense. If you're confused, you're confused. That's what's happening. And so these minor insights and realizations, for me, that was a big one, because it took me back to my family and made me realize that if I was ever going to find the answer to the rest of the questions, it would have to be right through the middle of pouring concrete, running a construction company, living a family life, and everything I was already doing. And that was really helpful to me, because like I say, I was in this escapist mode, this fantasy idea of running off somewhere to the wilderness. Okay? So I simply continued doing what I was doing. Now the odd thing happened after about 10 years. I began to think, damn, am I always going to have to be sitting on a cushion, which is, for me, was fairly painful, and going on these retreats? Am I always going to have to be meditating like this and doing this Zen, these meditations and so forth? And on this particular retreat, and I didn't have an answer to that question yet, but I thought, well, if that's necessary, I guess that's what I'll have to do. But I wasn't really thrilled with that idea, because I didn't really like the idea of just sitting on a cushion forever and ever, in order to find whatever. And most people in Zen who, even if they get enlightened, they still sit on a cushion the rest of their life. That's their thing. They're really attached to that. And eventually, it's just, from a Zen master standpoint, it's just the way of life. Okay, they meditate. Okay, but I really wondered, is that necessary? Well, on this one retreat, I decided to intensify the retreat. And even though we were meditating 8 hours a day, there were a lot of breaks for lunch, and there was a work break, and then there was just a relaxation break after lunch. I thought, well, I'll intensify this retreat. Every time there's a break, I'll go out and I'll do my little practice. I didn't have a name for it then, but I'll go out and I'll just walk up and down the roads looking and listening, which is another form of meditation that I thought that might intensify the retreat. Maybe it'll lead to another realization or breakthrough of some sort. And as a matter of fact, it did intensify the retreat. It had a much more powerful unifying effect when you combine that with everything else I was doing with the normal meditation. Well, at some point shortly after that, it dawned on me, gee whiz, when I'm sitting on a cushion watching the breath, I'm doing the same thing as when I'm out walking down the road looking and listening. There's really no difference. I'm shifting attention away from thoughts, either to the breath or to what can be seen or heard. And I thought, ATA minus T, I can do it all the time. I don't have to sit on a cushion for that. I can do it driving my truck. I can do it walking in the woods. I can do it anywhere. And so that's what I began to do. And that's when I began to lose interest in Zen, because Zen is kind of rigid. You got a lot of hardcore ideas. People get very attached to sitting. In fact, I don't even like to call meditation a practice, because even though one connotation of the word practice is okay, the other connotation is not, because in a certain sense people think they're practicing to get something, all right? Or, it's sort of like, how can you practice your way to being what you already are? All right? So I began to call it an activity. I just consider meditation an activity, whatever. And ATA minus T was the one I used the most once I had that realization. Driving down the road in my truck, I'm just looking and listening. I love hiking in the woods and love climbing mountains, and so I would go on these solo retreats where from the moment I left town till I got back, all I'm doing is just looking and listening. Flying in the airplane, walking in the airport, hiking in the mountain, looking and listening. And for those of you who've gone on silent retreats, you'll probably realize that on retreats, especially if it's a neat wilderness area where there are nice hiking trails and so forth, the more you really pay attention to what's there, it has a unifying effect. And so after those kind of retreats, you come back, it's hard to describe, but very deeply peaceful and very unified. And unusual stuff begins to happen because a lot of people report after retreats non-local events, and that happens too. You can also get into the zone doing that. You can just become lost in it. So as I mentioned last night, my over 15-year period, every question I had finally got answered. I had no more questions. But I knew I wasn't free. I had no idea why. But I thought, my wife and I talked about it before I went on this one hiking retreat in Colorado. And I said, I don't know what it is. I don't have a single existential question left, but I don't feel free. Well, the reason I didn't feel free is because there was still a me at the center of everything. I was still saying, I don't feel free. Okay? And on this particular retreat, a new question arose. Golly, I have these experiences where selfhood disappears, but it always returns, or that's the way it seemed. But selfhood is really just a product of thought. It's like an ingrained pattern of thought, and it's probably the deepest pattern of thought. It's the hardest thing to break through. So the question became, how can I stay in a unified state of mind all the time? How is it possible to remain in a selfless state of mind? It was like asking, how can I get rid of I? Can't do it. You can't. I can't get rid of me. Okay, that isn't how it works. But that was the question I was contemplating as I was hiking in the mountains, and just in my style of this, because I had learned this through koan contemplation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. When you contemplate a koan, you verbalize the koan, you think about the koan, you think about what I want to know, and then you shift your attention away from thoughts. It's just like Einstein said. He leaves thinking behind, he swims in silence, and suddenly the truth appears. And so on that particular solo hiking trip, I was doing ATA minus T a lot, but that was the one question in the back of the mind. How is it possible to stay in a unity conscious state of mind, the state of mind in which the self isn't there? How is that possible for that to become permanent? And on this particular day, August 17, 1999, I was hiking up Mount Audubon and began to feel I became overwhelmed with gratitude for life, for everything, everybody I knew, for everything that had ever happened, the good stuff, the bad stuff, just deep gratitude. And I became very emotional. And sometimes, and I'm a thinker, and hiking and solo retreats frequently generate a certain amount of emotionalism for me anyway, because it's a very connecting type thing. And after that experience of gratitude and that sort of a deep emotional release type thing, I came down the mountain feeling like something's missing. And a couple hours later, I looked inside, and the whole inside was gone. Always before, I could check in to see what Bob thought about everything. Bob was gone. And it was just immediately obvious there had never been a Bob Harwood. The whole damn thing was just a story. It was just an illusion. It was a thought structure. That's the way I thought about it. And it had just vanished. Now, I can't tell you what happened. I don't know whether there was a neural pathway in the brain that suddenly shifted. That's very possible. Because again, when you meditate for a long period of time, it affects the brain. The brain has what's called plasticity. And it could very well be that selfhood is a particular neural pathway. And many of the brain scientists now think that's true. They call it the default mode network. You probably read about that in Poland's book called How to Change Your Mind. And sometimes people take a drug, for example, like psilocybin or something, boom, and they have a sudden realization, oh, I'm not who I thought I was, okay? And weren't any drugs in my case, but all of a sudden it was obvious there had never been a me in any sense. The whole thing had been a story. And then immediately thereafter, it was like, well, if there's no me, who's doing all this? You know, what's seeing? Who's the actor here? And then it was like, oh, how obvious. It's the whole field of reality. It's this. It's the total cosmos that does everything. It grows human bodies. It grows intellects. It evolves intellects that use images, ideas, and symbols to represent the world. And the intellect is like, it's like a simulation computer. It's sort of like we look at the world, which is actual, and our intellect names it, categorizes it, and simulates it in the mind. So in a sense, almost all adults live in what I would call a meta-reality that's created by images, ideas, and symbols. Okay? And they don't live in reality itself because they don't really perceive what is. They perceive their thoughts about what is. And so this path is a path of seeing through those illusions and discovering what's really happening at the deepest level. Okay? So you've got TM, a lot of people do that, mantra recitation. And I heard a Zen master laugh one time and say, you don't have to have any special secret words in your mantra. You can say Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola if you want to, and it'll work just as well. All right? Because what you're really doing is you're shifting attention away from thoughts. I'm not crazy about a mantra or some of the things the Tibetans do, visualizations and all that, because I didn't want to put anything more in my head. I already had enough. I wanted to be rid of what was in my head. Okay, so I was never really attracted to visualizations or mantras, even though I experimented with those. I was more interested in just, can I be here now, looking at what's here, what is. Okay? I was in a Korean Zen tradition, and I brought this along just to, when we used to chant, we used this thing called moktak, and this is really a fascinating little instrument. And when you chant the Heart Sutra or whatever, listen to this sound. When you chant to that sound, boy, that sound has a way of really getting inside. That's really powerful. And also the gong, you know, listening to a gong. You can hit a gong, we did that a lot, and listen to it as the sound dies away and so forth. A lot of different techniques like that. Nisargadatta used staying with the sense of I am. That was his teacher told him. You know, Nisargadatta, probably most of you know his story, but he went to his teacher and he says, I was a real simple man. I went to a guy that I trusted, this guru. And the guru says, you are the ultimate. He said, I didn't know what he was talking about, but I knew he knew. And he said, stay with the sense of I am, the sense of being, and stay with that. And that's what he did. He said, I was a simple guy and I trusted him, so I just did that around the clock. He said, at first it took a lot of effort because, again, any meditative activity, thoughts come in, you get carried away with some ideas about this, that, or the other, and so forth. But he stayed with it. 3 years later, the guy woke up. In Zen, the primary meditation for long-time meditators is called shikantaza. Are you all familiar with that? Mm-hmm. Okay. Shikantaza basically is meditating without a focus. It's like raising alertness to the highest possible level and staying in that state. And that is actually the standard form of meditation in Soto Zen particularly, and also in Rinzai. Mm-hmm. But there's breath, you know, when you're someone new to meditation, they teach breath counting because that's about all you can do. And there's no way you can do shikantaza starting off. Breath counting, when you no longer have to count, once there's a little bit of calmness in the mind, we do breath following, feeling the breath. Lot of different Zen breathing meditations.
Because I was thinking actually this focus with alertness without focus. I think this kind of difficult technique. I was always curious, like how to have like a lot of energy of awareness at the same time, not focus. Because any time I would like try to go back and like, not focus on something, you can become like more like sleepy or something if you have any kind of tiredness. Like it's really hard to raise the energy or raise the alertness and without focus, because it's like focus brings the energy. Without focus, it seems like you might want to like sleep or something.
Right.
Seems like a paradox almost.
Right. And then there are also body awareness, yoga, qigong, tai chi. All those are body awareness forms of meditation in which you really just focus on body movements and so forth. There are just dozens of different ways of doing it, but anything that shifts attention away from thought. So what I tend to recommend to people is that you experiment with a lot of these things. I did. I experimented with probably 40 different forms of meditation. And you'll find that there are usually just one or two you resonate with. And whatever that is, do that. If you feel like changing, do that. You can't make a mistake. That's, if I could leave you one thought, that's one. You cannot make a mistake, because who you think you are is not what's doing all this. In other words, what you really are is infinite, undivided. There is no separation at all. You're always looking at the absolute. This is the absolute manifesting right now as 6 people sitting in a room. That's how it's manifesting. Whatever you're doing is exactly what you must be doing. If you're confused, that's what's happening.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I want to know if you could talk about a little bit, because you said some stuff about not thinking, and I wasn't sure if I was maybe reading between the lines. I mean, is your experience that you don't think anymore, or is there like a different relationship with your thoughts? Because to me, like, as vision and feeling sense and all that, as well as thoughts, are like, they're phenomenon in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I wanted to know if you could talk about kind of your relationship
Sure.
with thought, maybe what you
Sure.
mean by that.
What I discovered, and again, I don't work in the same kind of field that Sean Pethel works in, where his job is abstract thought, and he has to continually be thinking. Even he probably doesn't have to continually do it, but he's really into his work. He enjoys it. He doesn't have a problem with it, so there's no problem. For most people, 95% of thought is just a habit, not necessary at all. In other words, yeah, in my case, since I did ATA minus T for a year, I can stop thinking anytime. Okay? Just total silence. Usually when I hike in the woods, it's total silence. And I'm not saying anybody should do that. I'm just saying that's just how it manifested here. Okay? So, again, thoughts are just like the intellect produces thoughts. Okay? But they're not necessary. If the mind is totally silent, the body will function intelligently. Like right now, if you didn't have another thought for 20 minutes, you would have no problem getting up when the session's over and going to do whatever needs to be done next, understanding what anybody said to you. No thought would be necessary at all. It's just a habit. It's like an overlay. Okay, so you've got reality, and then you've got this overlay that's created by thought. It's a meta-reality that sort of is on top of the reality. And most people live through the meta-reality, through the thoughts and so forth. So, are feelings real? Sure. You feel, and if thoughts occur. And that's what actually led me to call it ATA minus T. I was giving a talk one time and somebody broke in and said, well, aren't thoughts actual? And that stopped my train of thought for a moment. I went, yeah, I guess so. So I said, I really need to change that, because I used to call it ATA. I tell people, do ATA. And then I realized, oh yeah, okay, there's a difference here. And then I realized ATA plus T is mindfulness, but I'm really pointing to ATA minus T. All right, so ATA minus T is attending the actual without thinking. All right, so if the mind becomes totally silent, you can drive a car, you have no problem intelligently doing whatever it is you're doing. It's not necessary. Now, if you're having to solve some abstract issue, like Sean works in, sure. But the problem for most people is that thought is a master rather than a servant. Okay, and so this path is a path Number one, becoming present. All right? This whole path is about forgetting the past and the future and focusing on what's here and now always. Okay? Because that's what's actual. All right? And as you focus on the present moment, and as you meditate and you have these realizations and breakthrough, what you'll discover is that many times you're attached to thoughts and you're not even aware of it. They're so subtle you're not even aware that you have an attachment to some particular set of ideas. Until suddenly, bam, there's that sudden insight that Einstein's writing about. And he's talking about, and in fact, the eureka moment in modern science is exactly the same thing as what we're calling, or what we're talking about as existential realizations. It's just that the eureka moment is within the conceptual world. The scientist has an imaginary meta-reality of reality, okay? In modern physics, that's one of the things that hit me intuitively at a certain point in college. I realized they aren't ever going to find the smallest particle of matter because somehow we're creating those particles. It's sort of like, can you ever get to the end of the log if you jump half the distance each time? Never get to the end. It became obvious to me at a certain point they'll just build more machines and they'll have to have weirder and weirder particles to try to explain what's going on because it's a head game, all right? So there's nothing wrong with the head game as long as you realize what it is and you realize it's not going to give you any absolute truth. The intellect only deals with what's relative. So the meta-reality is relative, and we're only interested here in what's absolute. And the absolute truth is this. So in that sense, this is talking to itself.
What would you say is, I don't know if you can even say that there is one, but I'm just curious about these, you talked about at a certain point there was like a sense of being an individual that had kind of left. Could you say, do you have a sense of what was blocking you from seeing that, or
as far as
until that moment?
No. It's just like Einstein said, when an insight occurs, you have no idea how or why it happened. Uh-huh. It's just like, bam, all of a sudden it becomes obvious. And I suspect that's one of the good things about the Zen tradition that I just happened to accidentally join. By using koans, I developed a certain amount of confidence in the fact that if I wanted to know something existentially, I could clearly state what it was I wanted to know, think about it, and then shift attention away from that and rely upon something deeper taking over and resolving it. And that was actually very helpful because not only do you have these formal Zen koans and all the standard kind of existential koans, but we have what I call personal koans. Should I marry this person or not marry this person? Should I stay in this job that's paying me really well that I don't enjoy? Or should I take this other job that pays less but would be a lot more fun? Mm-hmm. Those are kind of personal koans that people deal with.
Sure.
And I had a personal koan that came up that was a relationship type koan. And because I had solved so many koans, I had real confidence that I could find an answer. Mm. In this particular case, it really came down to a matter. I really thought that my wife might leave me because she really wanted me to go to this course that she was involved in called life training. And it was very meaningful to her, but I went to one meeting and I realized not interested, okay? But she thought it would really be good if I went and joined them. And just to give you an idea how funny it was to me, the very first exercise they gave us, I think there were 20 of us in the room, they gave us a sheet of paper. And the first exercise was write down every resentment that you had. Now, by this time I'd been in Zen for many years. And I sat there and I sat there and I sat there and people writing like crazy all around me. And I had no resentments, I have nothing to put on the piece of paper. And the person conducting the thing came by and they said, "You don't have any resentments?" I said, "I can't think of one." And they said, "You're in denial." And I thought, you don't get it. I don't have any resentments, So because she really wanted me to go to that so badly and was putting a lot of pressure on me, and it really became a big deal. Mm. I sat down one day on a Saturday morning. I think I even wrote about it in the book. Anyway, on this particular day, I got to resolve this issue. I got to deal with this. And so there was the question: should I go to life training because my wife wants me to go? It might mean we stay together, or if I don't go, it might mean she leaves. I don't know. And so what do I do? And once I clearly stated the problem, I just sat there on a Saturday. It was somewhere around 4 hours. I sat in the chair. All of a sudden, bam! This image arose from a movie, Forrest Gump movie. And I saw that image, and it was crystal clear. Had to be true to myself. If she left, I'd love her forever, but she'd have to go do whatever she had to do. I had to be true to myself. No way I was going to life training. It was just, I just can't tell you how clear it was. And so when she came home that day, I said, honey, I ain't going to life training. If you want to leave, that's fine. I'll love you. It ain't going to change anything as far as my feelings for you. But that was just an example of a personal koan that was answered exactly the same way. But when the answer appeared, there was no doubt whatsoever. It was like, no matter what, you have to be true to yourself. Okay? And what's true for you may not be true for anybody else. And it takes a certain amount of, I won't even say courage, it's not even that, because it's really beyond any concept. Okay? It's just getting in touch with what's really, really deep. What is it that you have to do? And so that same methodology can be used on any existential question, whether it's a personal koan or whether it's a formal koan or any of the other major koans.
I can be attached to feeling sometimes I feel closer to feelings, maybe can get from thoughts away, but the sense of self is for me mostly like a feeling. But what's I am is clearly more like a feeling, and even my sense of what I'm resisting to, I'm a doer or not, it's all closer to a feeling to me, some kind of moving, and I'm seem to be really attached to this. So even if I can sometimes remove some thoughts, I sometimes see feelings or images, kind of feeling-based images would come in uncontrollably, kind of. So I think maybe it could be also harder to get disattached to feelings and to thoughts.
Yeah, and actually, from talking to people, I've realized that some people are real hardcore thinkers. I was a thinker primarily. Myers-Briggs and some of the psychology tests, point this out. And some people are really more feelers than they are thinkers. And some people are a mixture of both. But just as I was a real hardcore thinker, and it may be, and I've speculated about this, it may be because I had so many strong interests growing up, and I identified so strongly with those interests. I always thought of myself as a geologist or an anthropologist or a paleontologist or astronomer, because science was my initial thing, and then later it was whatever it was, an artist, a writer, a sports car driver, whatever. We had these, well, I'm a husband, I'm a man, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a Democrat or Republican, we have all these identifications, and you're none of that. All of those are ideas, they're all imaginary.
But also, if you think you're someone who feels like that, it's also imaginary. I'm pretty sure, but sometimes it's just you connect, you merge, you stick to this feeling. It's harder for me to get unstuck than to just thought would be easier to put away.
Yeah.
Because it's feeling energetically that's what makes it sticky.
Yeah, and the only reason that I don't strongly recommend mindfulness is because thoughts are so sticky. At least that's the term I use for them. And so when I practiced mindfulness initially, when I was experimenting with lots of different techniques and meditative activities, I just discovered that when I watched thoughts, a lot of the times I would jump onto the thoughts and ride off into the distance, get on the thought train and disappear, and then wake up 10 minutes later, oh yeah, what was I doing? I was watching thoughts. They're just sticky, and that's one reason that I was never that interested in that. I was more interested in what's here and now, what's actual, what can we see, hear, taste, touch, smell, so forth.
I don't know if this is a question also, but it's something, I don't know.
They're all good. You can't make a mistake.
Doing some of the, I guess they're similar to like attend the actual type exercises. I was doing some with the group earlier this year, and one of the things they had was, you know, look in all 5 senses and see if you can find a self. And in the exercise, like, oh, I can't find a self. And then, you know, it's later in the day, and I'm like, well, I feel like an individual. There's a feeling sense of existing and being an individual. And the group wasn't really that helpful when I brought that up, but I don't know what, like, if you had any experience with that, or if you're...
Well, the sense of being is always here.
Right.
You know, and like I say, that's what Mr. Gadada focused on. He just happened to pick that particular thing because his guru told him. So the sense of being is here.
Right.
You know?
But can it fall away? It falls away sometimes.
Yeah, it can. Yeah. And the sense of separation, that's thought-based.
Yeah.
Okay, because there really isn't any separation. You know, I've done classes with honor students at the university where I ask them to search for boundaries. All boundaries are imaginary. And the standard one I give them is, we call this a hand, wrist, and an arm. Take a magic marker and show me where the hand stops and the wrist begins. Can't do it.
Right.
Once you go to put a magic marker there, you go, well, you know, it's all connected. And in the same way, we're connected to the air we breathe and everything else. There are no real boundaries. And so somebody will say, well, what about an automobile? Aren't there rigid boundaries? No, if you know anything at all about science, you know the surface of the automobile is oxidizing all the time. Come back in a few thousand years, it isn't there anymore. It's oxidized away. You know, everything's changing.
Yeah.
When you say, you know, the sense of self is still there, do you mean there's still a thought about the self, or is this?
There's a feel. It's like that's the thing that I'm struggling with. It's like there's no thought of self, and in the senses, it's like there's sensing and senses. It seems like.
Yeah.
But then later, it seems like there's just a feeling of existence. There's like beneath at a feel. There's like a thought level. There's like, you know, somebody hurt my feelings. Oh man. Or there's like egos. But then it feels like even deeper inside, there's a feeling of just that I'm existing as something that's different from this.
Well, I think that is the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's whole, like, Nisargadatta's thing is not like, oh, you're going to get a solid bead on the I am.
Yeah.
Because his whole point is it exists as non-investigation. It's by not looking, it's by not seeing it that you sense it. So it's like, when you're talking about the minus T, like, I guess that makes sense to me, but I guess I would question whether thoughts are actual or they're of the same form as like 5 senses, because the confusing thing about thoughts is, it seems to me, is when you're actually looking at thoughts, let's say, they disappear. You experience thinking as the thinker.
Yeah.
Right.
You don't experience thought as like,
Right.
oh, I can see thoughts like
Right.
a cloud. Like when people say that, I'm like, no, you don't. You know, because like that's what like Paul Hederman's thing is. You don't identify with the self. There isn't a self there that you identify. You identify as self.
Yeah. And
So
you only
it's like
recognize
that's
it-
the conundrum.
You only recognize it afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some sort of like vague sense of, like you perfectly said it. Like
Yeah.
there's this vague sense of I'm a self, but I don't even really know what that means.
Yeah.
And it's like
Yeah.
my sense is like that's the line of inquiry.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
Just it's kind of confounding.
Well, and I'm really interested too, for people who are primarily feelers, I'm always interested in what was their process of, of realization and so forth. I've talked to other people who are thinkers, and they've had something similar happen to what I had. I talked to Tess Hughes, and she said, yeah, on a particular, that one day I looked inside, it was gone. So there's certain people that sense of self seems to be some kind of a thought structure that just vanishes. You know, but for feelers, I don't really know how that happens because I'm not primarily a feeler. I'm way more of a feeler now because I don't know what it is, but maybe it's getting older. but you know, as thoughts became less and less important, I felt more because I wasn't thinking so much. You know, so feelings, you know, I became more emotionally open.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting difference in human beings. And all of us are really unique. An interesting combination. Nobody's solely a thinker or solely a feeler. You know, it varies. Just sometimes you're primarily one or the other. But yeah, that is fascinating.
Because when you say like you're more like I am this, like not like I am that. But everybody said like on the path like something like I'm not this, not that, or nothing of you will remain. So it's like you're trying to back away and like from everything that can be perceived or felt as not you. So it's like trying to find unexpressed something, like go back to the unexpressed. But somehow it can connect back, like then the this can also, the expressed can be also kind of merged with the unexpressed in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's of course not understandable by the mind, it's like paradoxical. It's like, and what is the unexpressed is already paradoxical, but how can they be like one is another level of paradoxical.
Right. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I found a quote here that I thought folks might be interested. I can spot it here. There's one I found by Ramana that's pretty interesting. I can find what I did with it. I got a lot of interesting quotes, but yeah. So somebody asked Ramana, question: Brahman is real. It's this Hindu word for God. The world is an illusion, is the stock phrase of Sri somebody. Yet others say the world is reality, which is true. And Ramana says this. He says, both statements are true. They refer to different stages of development and are spoken from different points of view. The aspirant starts with the definition, that which is real exists always. Then he eliminates the world as unreal because it is changing. The seeker ultimately reaches the self, and there finds unity as the prevailing note. Then that which was originally rejected as being unreal is found to be part of the unity. Being absorbed in the reality, the world also is real. There is only being in self-realization and nothing but being. And that's really what Richard Rose was talking about when he says, I didn't like his phrase, becoming the truth. You already are the truth. All right. What he really meant was realizing that you are the truth. You know, and I like the phrase that Jesus used, the living truth, because in the cosmic consciousness experience, it seemed to me that reality was a living presence. That's the only way I can describe it. It was like the whole thing's alive. It's like even the space between air molecules is alive and intelligent. There's nothing here that's not intelligent, and the whole thing is connected. It's like, even connected is not quite right because there's not two things that connect. It's just unified. And somebody said, well, aren't you, when you say I'm this, aren't you identifying as this? I'm saying, no, I'm just recognizing that this is what I am. I am the truth. I am reality. And I think that's what Jesus was saying when he said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I think he's really talking about that for everybody, you know. Everybody's one with the absolute. No separation. But sometimes it helps to do the thought experiments. Some of the honor students, when they did a bunch of these thought experiments, when I asked them to see if they could find a boundary anywhere that defined anything, 2 or 3 of them, you know, they were young, and they had several of them had, you know, realizations and insights into that. They had never really thought about it before. They didn't really realize, oh, there really aren't any boundaries. I used to ask people, it feels like I'm this body. You know, I said, well, where's the boundary of the body? When you open your mouth, where's the boundary between your upper lips and the lower lips? It's all imaginary. Or I would say, drink a glass of water. When does the water become you? You know, once you begin to invest at the collision of boundaries, sometimes it's much easier to see. You know, I'd say, well, does the water become you when it's 1 inch away from your mouth? When it enters your mouth? When it goes down your throat? You know, when does that glass of water become you? You know, you start investigating boundaries, and there's some thought experiments there that help make it obvious that, boy, there's a big illusion here. Any other questions?
What was that clarity that you were talking about before? You know, you had that personal Cohen, and you got that image of Forrest Gump, and what made you say this is?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting point. I didn't really tell you. The image that I got of Forrest Gump that just suddenly appeared in the mind. You remember in the movie where the girl he loves has left, and he's heartbroken, and he's running across the country back and forth from shore to shore. I remember that. You know, what came up was that image of him running across the country. And when I saw that, I thought, okay, I get it. If my wife leaves me over this issue, I'll just go out and hike the Continental Divide. Since I like to mountain climb anyway, you know, I probably wouldn't go coast to coast. I'd just pick something like the Pacific Crest Trail or the Appalachian Trail, and I'd just start walking. Because I realized what he was doing in running across the country, he was internalizing the pain of loss. And I realized, oh yeah, I could do that, no problem. So it became obvious that if I were forced to do that, you know, I said, I'm not going to life training. He said, okay, I'm out of here. You know, I'm leaving. You know, I thought, okay, I'll put the business on hold. I'm heading off to the mountains. And I realized any pain can be internalized like that.
That kind of came to you as a image that you then interpreted as a thought. So it's just, it seems so different than some of the other stuff you were talking about.
Yeah, it was different. It was quite unlike any other one. That one just popped up as an image. But as soon as I saw it, and remembering the movie and remembering why he was running across the country, it became obvious that, oh yeah, I love to hike anyway. And you know, I might not run, but it might take 1,000 miles. I have no idea. You know, it takes different things to it. You know, my brother, when he died in a car accident at the age of 30. And, you know, people process grief in different ways. I sat for almost a month at night, and all I would do was just listen to his favorite music. And my wife, we lost a baby. Our first child died during childbirth, immediately after childbirth. And she had never knitted before. She started knitting a rug, and that's all she did after that was just knit this rug. And it took about a month. Never finished the rug, but that was just her way of dealing with that. You know, and people process loss and grief in different ways. But it became obvious, and when that one image came, it became obvious to me, oh yeah, I could deal with anything, no matter what it is. The most important thing was just being true to myself and accepting the consequences of that. Now the odd thing was, and that was what was so funny, it had been such a big issue. When she came home and I said, honey, I hate to say this, I ain't going to life training, you know. It ended it. It was like it was so obvious to her that it was so clear to me that it just ended the whole issue totally. And a few weeks later, she gave up life training too. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. You know, I mean, life is hysterical, really. I mean, there's so many funny things like that happen. You know. Yeah, it's really. I've seen that happen in 2 or 3 cases, but that was really the most dramatic.
It's interesting. It sounds. I don't know. Just thinking about myself, you know, it sounds like you really had a confidence. I think you said confidence that not only could you trust what was coming up from you, but you knew that you were going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really feel that way. I feel like, you know, when you talk about you can't make a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel that way either. I feel that, you know, if I'm not careful, I can be lost in pain and despair and never have clarity, because I feel like I've lived large chunks of my life that way,
Mm-hmm.
where I didn't know what was going on, I felt really confused, I didn't know where there were answers, and I want to avoid going back to that. So, and I don't have a sense that that'll happen I had a sense that that could happen again, you know? And so it's, my emotional state right now is kind of opposite in a lot of ways, some of the things you're talking about. So that's why I'm asking questions about it, I guess.
Sure. Well, and we're all different. You know, we're all really unique. Our past experiences, our conditioning, everything that's happened to us in our life is really unique. No two of us are following exactly the same path. And so all I can tell you is that I have a great deal of confidence in the kind of things that can occur if you become detached from thoughts. And again, there's nothing really wrong with thought if you're detached from it. The problem is people have all these ideas, negative ideas. Like I said, I was skinny in high school, so I was very sensitive about being skinny. You know, if somebody's overweight, they're very sensitive about being overweight. You know, we have these ideals and so forth, and we're comparing ourselves. Zen calls it comparing mind. Okay, and we're always judging ourselves. And amazingly, most people judge themselves more harshly than they judge anybody else. It's just amazing. You know, when I hear people talk about all their self-judgments, it's really heartbreaking, you know. But it just comes out of the experience that they've had and so forth. And so again, like I say, I always feel like I'm a cheerleader, you know, telling people you can get free. You can see through all this stuff, you know. In other words, Buddhism talks about, a lot of the Buddhist traditions talk about big mind. When they talk about big mind or Buddha mind, they're really talking about the whole array of mind, from the laptop to the mainframe. And so the idea, of course, is not being attached to what's going on with the laptop, because it's all imaginary. You know, there really is, I mean, we talk about duality and non-duality. There is no duality. Duality is all imaginary. You know, this is not imaginary. This is actual. And so if somebody walked up to me and said, all there is consciousness, or all there is awareness, something, I'd feel like picking up my Zen stick and wrap them on the shoulders. Who feels this, you know? It's like, this is actual. In fact, that actually happened to me in a Zen interview. I got wiped out by a Zen teacher one time in an interview. Actually got hit with a Zen stick because I'd had an insight, but thoughts had got hold of that insight. And I decided I was enlightened, and I went in to confront the teacher to demonstrate my vast enlightenment. I got hit big time with a Zen stick, because I understood some things, but I didn't understand enough to challenge him at the level I was challenging him at. And yeah, it's a funny path. But it is, as Sean said the other night, it's really the most exciting path of self-discovery.
What do you think about that? What do you think about what Bob said about that you can't make an error?
Well, the part that I picked up on just now that you said was you have faith about what's possible when you get attention off of thoughts. That's what I heard. And so to me the key was to not make an error, or to have faith. You know, the step to take is to get attention off of thoughts.
That's not what I heard.
There you go.
We can discuss after.
I mean, that's one of the things I specifically kind of heard in that. I mean, because it reminds me, for instance, if you do a lot of meditation, the synchronicities and things that start to kind of line up it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
It's like there's a fluidity, and I can see where that could take another step and go beyond that, where you actually realize that.
Yes.
And your being, and are then trusting in
That's
a certain
right.
way.
Yeah, the place I hear that come up most often is when people get into meditation and they wonder, are they doing it right? Okay? And no one can tell you what's the best for you. You know, as I say, there are 20 major types of meditation. You know, one person might be attracted to Tai Chi, or maybe to breath awareness, the Zen style. You know, there are people that just hate sitting on a cushion and that don't like sitting meditation at all. So The big advantage to ATA minus T, and the reason I emphasize that a lot, is that you can do it anywhere, anytime. So I don't know what the time factor function is. In other words, a lot of people who have a meditation practice may practice, let's say, 20 minutes a day. A typical Zen student might practice 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes at night, or maybe 30 minutes a day or something like that, okay? ATA minus T, you can do it all the time. Anytime that you're not having to be involved in something else. If you're driving down the road, just looking and listening, you know, if you're walking in the wood, you're just looking and listening. You don't have to be doing other things, you know, and so forth. So it's like you actually end up spending a lot of time, you know, not thinking and shifting attention away from thoughts. And that's what allows, after a certain period of time, then the mind becomes really silent in relation to earlier. You know, one time, a funny story, Eckhart was at some sort of a weird, I can't remember what it was, some sort of a gala event, and they had a big glass tank or something, and they had some guy, as part of a demonstration, go underwater and hold his breath for 7 minutes, okay? And afterwards, Eckhart was talking to him, and the guy said to Eckhart, "Can you hold your breath for 7 minutes?" And Eckhart said, "No, but I can stop thinking for 7 minutes." The whole place cracked up because, you know, Eckhart spends a lot of time in silence, and he was really drawn to that. And he was somebody whose negative thoughts drove him almost to suicide. And he was one of those people in abject despair when he had a, you know, huge breakthrough. And so, that's why I resonate with this statement about compulsive thought. Because I had a friend one time that used to come to meditation, and he quit. And after a while, one day I said, "How come you quit coming to meditation?" He said, "Well, I meditated for 2 years and my mind never slowed down at all." You know? And interestingly enough, it isn't absolutely necessary that the mind stop. I use Art Tickner as an example of that. Art loves to tell people his mind never slowed down. There are people that do realize whose minds stay pretty active. That just wasn't the case here. You know, it seemed to me that insights occurred following silence. And that could be different for other people. But it's something to play with. And the reason I a lot of times tell people about all these different meditative styles is that find something you resonate with, you know, if you want to go that path. You know, self-inquiry is another path. You know, really looking in. See if you can find the self. Good luck with that. But you have to, you basically, I'm also pointing to trusting yourself. And so I tell people, trust yourself 100%. Nobody else can tell you what you ought to be doing. You know, we can point to these different directions and say this is helpful to some people, this is helpful to some people, but, you know, each person has to decide, you know, what they resonate with and work with.
Becoming your own authority, right?
Yeah. But once I found TAT and some of the other Advaita Vedanta teachers, I found that retreats could be a lot more fun. You know, because the Zen retreats are pretty heavy duty. Anyone who's been on a 3 or 7 day silent retreat, you know, meditated 8 hours a day sitting on a cushion, it's a lot more fun in the relaxed kind of atmosphere that we have here. Where you can,
satsang's more fun, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went on a retreat one time, a joint Buddhist-Christian retreat at the Abbey of Gethsemane, and that was really interesting. They invited a Zen master to come talk to them, and he changed all the koans into Christian koans, and that was really fascinating. So we had like not half, I think we had about maybe 10 Buddhists there, and then of course all the Christian monks that were there. That was the abbey that Thomas Merton made famous. And And that was really an interesting retreat because the Zen master he had questions for him like, where is God this moment? You know, and like one of the Christian koans that I ask a lot of times, you know, people say Jesus was a pacifist, turn the other cheek. And yet, you know, he walked in the temple one day and turned over the tables of the money changers, you know. So the Christian koan, was that the act, when he turned over the tables of the money changers, was that the act of a pacifist or an activist? So the answer to that koan is not in words. Okay. So, anybody see that one? When he turned over the tables of the money changers, was that the act of an activist or a pacifist? And you got to realize, activist, pacifist, those are both concepts. Okay? What was the truth? If you see through it, your body will just automatically do that. Yeah. That's beyond either the idea of an activist or a pacifist.
The action that comes from like silence or something like that. Like it's impossible to live after some silence, after some not moving, like some movement will happen anyways, like you sit or try to like sit or something, and suddenly, I don't know, something changes, something moves in you, I guess. Can't control it.
Yeah, I think Richard Rose had a lot of really good ideas. You know, I like his laddering idea and his friendship thing. That's something you find in TAT. You don't find too many other places. You know, there are a lot of satsang teachers and so forth, and it's just more of an adoration of the guru or whatever. Mm-hmm. But here, it's much more of a, you know, everybody here's, it's really friends on the same path type thing. It's really, really neat. It's a neat organization.